326 years. That is how long it has been since the Cascadia Subduction Zone last fully ruptured. 326 years since January 26, 1700, when a magnitude 9.0 earthquake split the seafloor off the Pacific Northwest coast, dropped the Oregon and Washington coastline by several feet in minutes, and sent a tsunami crashing into Japan so large that Japanese officials recorded it in their written historical records. The earthquake was so massive and Japan so far away that the Pacific Northwest's indigenous communities did not even realize for centuries that the trembling ground beneath them had sent a killer wave across an ocean. That was the last time. The average recurrence interval for a full Cascadia megathrust rupture is approximately 240 years. The Cascadia fault is statistically overdue. And right now, at this moment, a USGS and NOAA research vessel is actively out on the Pacific Ocean, mapping the Cascadia Subduction Zone seafloor. The cruise began July 31st and runs through August 23rd. Scientists are out there right now mapping the fault because new research published just months ago revealed something about Cascadia that changed every previous estimate of how dangerous the next rupture will be. The Juan de Fuca plate beneath northern Oregon is approximately 5 kilometers shallower than scientists previously calculated, 5 kilometers closer to the surface than the models assumed, and that difference, 5 kilometers, increases the estimated peak ground acceleration from a Cascadia megaquake by 9 to 17% along the coast of northern Oregon. Shaking that kills more people, shaking that destroys more buildings, 9 to 17% more than every earthquake preparedness plan written before 2026 accounted for. When a magnitude 4.9 earthquake hits off the Oregon coast, it hits in the context of all of that. Scientists are watching it closely. Here's why. It is Sunday, August 9th, 2026. And today we are talking about what offshore Oregon earthquakes actually mean, why even moderate magnitude events attract scientific attention, what the researchers currently at sea off the Pacific Northwest coast are finding, and what the latest discoveries about the Cascadia Subduction Zone mean for the 10 million people living in the Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver metropolitan areas. Let's go through all of it. A magnitude 4.9 earthquake struck off the coast of Oregon, and the first thing scientists do when they see any offshore Oregon earthquake is look at the location, because not all offshore Oregon earthquakes are created equal. The specific fault system that generated the earthquake determines almost everything about how it should be interpreted. The Oregon coast sits at the intersection of multiple offshore fault systems. The most important distinction, and the one scientists make immediately when any offshore Oregon earthquake occurs, is whether the event is on the Cascadia Subduction Zone itself or on one of the other offshore fault systems in the region. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is the main event. It is the 700-mile megathrust fault running from northern California to southern British Columbia, where the Juan de Fuca plate is sliding beneath the North American plate. This is the fault capable of producing a magnitude 9.0 or greater earthquake, lasting 3 to 5 minutes of violent shaking, generating a tsunami that would reach the Oregon coast within 15 to 30 minutes, and producing ground shaking intense enough to collapse unreinforced buildings across the Portland metropolitan area 70 miles inland. But the Cascadia Subduction Zone is famously quiet between its major ruptures. It does not produce a steady stream of small and medium earthquakes the way the San Andreas does. The Juan de Fuca plate is mostly locked against the North American plate, accumulating stress without releasing it in the small events that would provide seismological data about the fault's current state. Scientists have described this as one of the most challenging aspects of studying Cascadia. The relative quiet of the fault between megathrust events means the monitoring network has very little to work with compared to more seismically active zones. The other major offshore system is the Blanco Fracture Zone, a transform fault running east-west off the Oregon coast, where two sections of oceanic crust are sliding past each other. The Blanco Fracture Zone produces earthquakes regularly, including a magnitude 4.6 event approximately 2 weeks ago that was covered by the Grants Pass Tribune as a reminder of Oregon's active seismic landscape. That earthquake, the Tribune confirmed, occurred within the Blanco Fracture Zone. Scientists distinguished it from the Cascadia Subduction Zone and noted that earthquakes within the Blanco system are expected geological events and should not be interpreted as evidence that a large Cascadia earthquake is becoming more likely. When a new offshore Oregon earthquake appears on the seismograph network, the initial scientific focus is exactly this question: Blanco Fracture Zone or Cascadia? Transform fault or subduction zone? The answer changes everything about how the event is interpreted, what monitoring follows, and what the event means for the public. Here's the piece of this Oregon earthquake story that has nothing to do with the specific M4.9 event, and everything to do with why scientists are watching offshore Oregon seismicity more closely in 2026 than in any previous year. In April 2026, USGS seismologist Aaron Worth presented new research at the Seismological Society of America annual meeting that fundamentally revised one of the most critical parameters in Cascadia hazard assessment. The research team had used new seismic data to calculate the precise depth of the subduction zone interface. The plane where the Juan de Fuca plate meets the base of the North American plate and where the megathrust rupture will occur. The previous estimates placed the slab interface at approximately 25 kilometers depth near the coast of northern Oregon. The new research found the actual depth is about 20 kilometers, 5 kilometers shallower, 5 kilometers closer to the surface than every previous hazard model assumed. Why does 5 kilometers matter? Because the shaking intensity that reaches the surface from an earthquake depends strongly on the distance that seismic energy has to travel before arriving. A fault that is 5 kilometers closer to the surface delivers more of its energy to the buildings and people above it. Worth stated the implication precisely. This could increase estimated peak ground acceleration from Cascadia megathrust earthquakes by approximately 9 to 17% along the coast of northern Oregon. 9 to 17% more shaking intensity. That does not sound dramatic until you understand what that range means in structural engineering terms. Building codes for seismic safety are written to specific ground motion values, specific peak accelerations that structures are designed to withstand. A 9 to 17% increase in peak ground acceleration means that buildings designed to the previous standard may experience shaking that exceeds their design limit. The building does not know the engineers used the wrong depth estimate. It just fails when the shaking exceeds what it was built to handle. And simultaneously, the research team identified something else that had never been measured before: a deep sedimentary basin beneath Tillamook, Oregon. The Tillamook area, home to approximately 26,000 people in the northern Oregon Coast Range, sits above a sedimentary basin whose geometry and depth were previously unknown. Sedimentary basins amplify ground shaking during earthquakes. The loose, unconsolidated sediments act like a bowl of jello, magnifying the seismic waves passing through them. The Seattle Basin is the well-studied example. Ground shaking in downtown Seattle during a Cascadia rupture would be significantly amplified by the Seattle Basin's geometry. The newly discovered Tillamook Basin means the same amplification effect previously unmapped exists beneath northern coastal Oregon: more shaking from a shallower fault, more amplification from a newly discovered basin. The 2026 research has made the Cascadia hazard picture more alarming, not less. Here's the piece of this story that most people are completely unaware of, and that is directly relevant to why scientists are paying such close attention to offshore Oregon seismicity right now. From July 31st through August 23rd, 2026, a joint USGS-NOAA research cruise is actively operating in the Cascadia Subduction Zone offshore of Oregon. Right now, at this moment, scientists are aboard a research vessel in the Pacific Ocean, mapping seafloor depths, seafloor texture, and gas seeps in the Cascadia Subduction Zone. The USGS Cascadia Subduction Zone. Marine Geohazards Project describes the purpose of this work: to identify potential tsunami-genic faults, offshore areas prone to strong shaking, portions of the slope susceptible to landslides, and optimal environments for gas seep monitoring. These are the 4 categories of hazard that a Cascadia megathrust rupture produces beyond the shaking itself: the faults on the seafloor that can generate additional tsunamis, the specific offshore areas where the shaking will be most intense, the submarine slopes that will fail and generate additional tsunamis from landslides, and the gas seep patterns that inform our understanding of where stress is concentrated in the system. The timing of the cruise, July 31st through August 23rd, means that when the M4.9 earthquake struck off Oregon, there is a research ship in the water actively monitoring the seafloor in the region where it occurred. That is not a coincidence in a conspiratorial sense. It is a coincidence in the sense that the USGS planned this cruise during the peak summer research season, and moderate earthquakes off the Oregon coast happen to occur during the same window. But it does mean that the scientific monitoring of this week's seismic event is happening in a context where active at sea research is ongoing. Gas seeps are one of the specific targets of the current cruise because of what they indicate about the subduction zone's stress state. When the Juan de Fuca plate presses against the North American plate, fluids, water and methane primarily, are squeezed out of the sediment along the fault interface. Those fluids migrate upward through the seafloor and emerge as gas seeps that can be detected by acoustic equipment from research vessels. Changes in gas seep activity over time provide one of the few indirect indicators of stress changes on the locked megathrust fault, the fault that otherwise produces almost no small earthquakes to monitor. The USGS NOAA cruise is building the baseline dataset that future monitoring will use to detect those changes. Here's the piece of the Cascadia story that received major attention in the scientific community in May 2026, but that is directly relevant to interpreting any offshore Oregon earthquake. Research published in May 2026 and reported by Science Daily found that the Cascadia Subduction Zone and the San Andreas Fault, previously considered essentially independent seismic systems despite their geographic proximity, may be more connected than scientists previously understood. New research suggests these two of the most dangerous fault systems on the U.S. West Coast can influence each other in ways that affect both their behavior. The specific mechanism proposed by the research is stress transfer, the same static Coulomb stress transfer mechanism that links the Garlock Fault to the San Andreas in Southern California. When a large earthquake occurs on one fault system, it redistributes stress in the surrounding crust in ways that can either increase or decrease the failure probability on adjacent fault systems. The research suggested that a Cascadia megathrust rupture could trigger a response on portions of the San Andreas, and potentially that loading on the San Andreas system could affect the stress state on the southernmost portions of Cascadia. This connection matters for interpreting offshore Oregon seismicity because it means the Cascadia Fault does not exist in isolation. Its stress state, and any changes in that stress state that small earthquakes might reflect, has implications that extend south along the entire California coast. The May 2026 research was described by Science Daily as raising a double West Coast earthquake threat, the possibility that a major rupture on one system could be accompanied or followed by a major rupture on the other. The specific implication for an offshore Oregon M4.9 is not alarming in isolation. A single moderate earthquake does not dramatically alter the Cascadia-San Andreas stress relationship. But it is part of a larger picture of interconnected fault systems that scientists are now actively studying, and that the USGS NOAA cruise underway right now is helping to characterize. Here's the most recent and arguably most important monitoring discovery about the Cascadia Subduction Zone, reported by ABC News in May 2026. Scientists at the University of Washington, using the underwater seismometer networks funded in part by the $15 million NSF grant provided in 2023, have been able to detect strain accumulating in the northern part of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. The technique they used is seismic noise analysis. Instead of waiting for earthquakes to occur and analyzing the resulting seismic waves, they analyze the continuous background noise recorded by the underwater sensors and use it to map the subsurface structure and stress distribution. The strain accumulation detected in the northern portion of Cascadia is consistent with the expected behavior of a fully locked subduction zone. The Juan de Fuca plate and North American plate are stuck together, not slipping, with each passing year adding to the accumulated elastic strain energy that will eventually release in the next megathrust rupture. What makes this finding significant is not the detection of strain per se. Strain accumulation in Cascadia is expected and has been inferred from GPS data on land for decades. What makes it significant is that the underwater seismometer network is now able to directly detect and characterize it offshore, where the fault system is actually located, rather than inferring it indirectly from onshore GPS measurements. The research team noted something important about the northern segment specifically. When it eventually ruptures, it would rupture differently than other sections of the fault. The Vancouver Island study that Planet Brief documented in July 2026, which found seafloor that has dropped 5 kilometers along a fault, scientists described as close to breaking, is specifically about the northern Cascadia segment and its distinct structural behavior. The northern segment, the monitoring research, and the Vancouver Island seafloor study are all pointing at the same geographic area as the one that deserves the most specific attention. The University of Washington researchers also described the fundamental challenge that makes Cascadia so difficult to study. We don't have many earthquakes, so we really don't know what's going on in that offshore part of the subduction zone. That acknowledgement that the relative quiet of Cascadia between its major ruptures leaves scientists with limited data to work with is why every offshore Oregon earthquake, even a moderate M4.9, prompts scientists to watch closely. Each event provides data that the quiet subduction zone rarely offers. Here is the plain language description of what the Oregon Department of Emergency Management, the USGS, and the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network all agree a full Cascadia rupture would produce, because I think this context is essential for understanding why the monitoring of offshore Oregon earthquakes matters so much. A magnitude 9, 0 or greater full margin, Cascadia rupture would produce 5 to 7 minutes of intense ground shaking along the Oregon coastline. That shaking duration is not a typo. It is 5 to 7 minutes of sustained violent motion from a fault that is hundreds of miles long, releasing centuries of accumulated energy. For comparison, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, the one that collapsed the Bay Bridge and caused 63 deaths in California, lasted approximately 15 seconds. Cascadia at full rupture would produce shaking that lasts 20 to 28 times longer. The Oregon coast would drop several feet in minutes as the offshore fault zone rebounds from the locked position. Coastal communities would find themselves suddenly closer to sea level. Some areas could lose 2 to 3 feet of elevation permanently. Land subsidence of this kind increases the tsunami inundation zone for every subsequent storm and flood indefinitely. The tsunami would reach the Oregon coast within 15 to 30 minutes of the rupture. People on the Oregon coast who felt the earthquake shaking have roughly that much time to move to high ground before the first wave arrives. The tsunami potential for a full Cascadia rupture is for waves up to 100 feet in height in specific channelized locations, though open coast wave heights would typically be lower. For comparison, the 2011 Tohoku tsunami, which killed nearly 20,000 people in Japan, produced waves of similar magnitude. Portland, 70 miles inland, would experience intense shaking amplified by the Willamette Valley's sedimentary deposits, which trap and amplify seismic waves the same way the Tillamook Basin and Seattle Basin do. The Portland area has a significant inventory of unreinforced masonry buildings, brick, structures built before modern seismic codes, that are specifically known to perform catastrophically in major earthquake shaking. This is what the scientists monitoring offshore Oregon earthquakes are monitoring for, not because a M4.9 means the Cascadia rupture is imminent. It does not. But because any offshore Oregon earthquake provides an opportunity to refine the monitoring dataset, test the early warning systems, and add another data point to the characterization of a fault system that will, at some unknown future time, produce the most destructive natural disaster in the recorded history of the Pacific Northwest. Here is the specific preparedness information that the Oregon Department of Emergency Management, the USGS, and the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network all agree is relevant for people living in the Cascadia hazard zone. Know the Shake Alert early warning system. Shake Alert is active in Oregon, Washington, and California. It provides seconds to potentially tens of seconds of warning before strong shaking arrives at your location from an offshore earthquake. Make sure your device is configured to receive wireless emergency alerts. That is the channel through which Shake Alert warnings are delivered to the public. Seconds of warning is enough time to drop, cover, and hold on, to stop a vehicle safely, to move away from glass and tall furniture. Know the drop, cover, and hold on protocol. Drop to your hands and knees so the earthquake cannot knock you off your feet. Take cover under a sturdy desk or table, or if none is available, against an interior wall away from windows. Hold on until the shaking stops. The specific Cascadia consideration, the shaking lasts 5 to 7 minutes. That is a long time. Stay in your covered position until the shaking completely stops. People who try to move during shaking are significantly more likely to be injured than those who stay covered. Know your tsunami zone and your evacuation route. If you live or work on the Oregon or Washington coast, your county has designated tsunami inundation zones, areas that would be flooded by a Cascadia-generated tsunami. Know whether you are in the inundation zone. Know the route to high ground from every location where you spend regular time. 15 to 30 minutes is not much time. If you feel violent shaking on the coast, do not wait for an official tsunami warning. The violent shaking itself is your warning. Move to high ground immediately. Know your building's seismic vulnerability. If you live or work in an older brick or unreinforced masonry building in the Portland, Salem, or Eugene areas, those buildings are among the most dangerous places to be during a Cascadia megathrust event. Oregon has been working on prioritizing seismic retrofits for unreinforced masonry buildings, but many remain unretrofitted. Know your building's construction type and its seismic performance designation if available. A magnitude 4.9 earthquake struck off the Oregon coast. Scientists watch closely because every offshore Oregon earthquake provides data that the normally quiet Cascadia Subduction Zone rarely offers. That attention is justified by what scientists have learned about Cascadia in 2026 alone. USGS seismologist Aaron Worth's April 2026 research found the subduction zone interface is 5 kilometers shallower than previously estimated, increasing projected peak ground acceleration from a megaquake by 9 to 17% along northern Oregon's coast. A previously unknown sedimentary basin beneath Tillamook was discovered, another amplification zone that no previous hazard model accounted for. May 2026, research confirmed that the Cascadia and San Andreas fault systems may be more interconnected than previously understood. The University of Washington's underwater seismometer network detected strain accumulating in the northern Cascadia segment using seismic noise analysis. And right now, from July 31st through August 23rd, a joint USGS-NOAA research cruise is actively mapping the Cascadia seafloor, measuring gas seeps, and characterizing the geohazards of a fault that has not ruptured since 1700, but that carries a 37% probability of producing a major earthquake in the next 50 years. The last full Cascadia rupture was January 26, 1700. The average recurrence interval is approximately 240 years. It has been 326 years. Scientists are watching. You should be too.